in this video, we're going to take a look at the various types of observational studies and experiments. And if you recall from our first video, we said an observational study is one in which the researcher tends to take a hands-off approach. Maybe just observing, taking notes, maybe asking questions on a questionnaire or survey, versus an experiment in which the researcher divides the subjects into groups, usually an experimental group that receives the treatment and a control group which either doesn't receive the treatment or receives a fake treatment called a placebo. So let's look at some observational studies. And our first one's called a cross-sectional study, and that's where data is collected and observed at one point in time. So for instance, we might want to take a look at the average height of an NBA basketball player, current NBA basketball player. So we look at our current rosters of teams and take samples from those rosters, or just look at the entire NBA roster. Our second kind is called a retrospective, and hopefully this prefix retro you've heard before, which refers to in the past. So we collect data from past events, whether it be historical artifacts, even fossils, things like that. But the data is not from the past, or not from the present rather, but from the past. So cross-sectional is present, retrospective is past. Our future is called longitudinal, which is future, collecting data from future data from groups with common factors. So we might want to follow a group of students who go through a particular school system and see over the course of time how well they do, and gather information from the future. And maybe not just once, but maybe over the course of time as well. So it doesn't have to just be once, but we can continue a study for a longitudinal study for quite a bit of time. For experiments, we have what's known as a blind experiment. And a blind experiment, the researcher knows what group, the experimental versus control group, that the subject is in, but the subject does not. And blind experiments are pretty effective because if the subject knows what group they're in, that could have an effect on their response to a particular treatment. So in order to minimize that risk of getting inaccurate responses, we can use a blind experiment in which the researcher will know, but the subject won't. Now, to add on to the blind experiment, we have what's known as a double-blind experiment, and that provides an even greater level of security because neither the researcher nor the subject knows what group the subject is in. So if there's any interaction between the researcher and the subject, in order to minimize the risk of the subject being able to find out through maybe subtle clues that the researcher gives them, we have what's known as a double blind. So neither the researcher nor the subject is going to know which of those two groups the subject is in, but a third party will know and will not reveal. So even stronger security measures for the blind experiment is the double blind experiment. So good experiments, when designing experiments, good experiments are going to take the following into consideration. So we want to assign subjects to different groups through some random selection process. And we talked about the different sampling methods. And again, the key is randomness. Even if it's a little bit of randomness to it, we still want to incorporate randomness if possible into our design. So experiments can be formed on more than one subject. This is known as replication. We have our sample size is large enough to see the true nature of the effects. We don't want to have, especially if we're testing out a new medication, we don't only want to test it out on, let's say, 12 people. We want to try to get a large enough sample size to get information about a wide variety of people and their reactions to, whether they be good reactions or bad reactions to the new medication that we're trying to test out and bring to market. And researchers are going to control the effects of our variables using such techniques as blinding, whether it be single blind, double blind, like that, because again, we do not want our subjects to be able to tell which group they happen to be in. So whether we use a single blind or a double blind experiment, we want to keep the subjects unaware for the purposes of um, testing out the effects of any kind of you know experiment, whether it be like medicine or whatever. So, all right, that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.